Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened about 10 years ago when I was a freshman in college. Back then, everything felt new and overwhelming. New campus, new people, new routines, new freedoms, and new responsibilities I didn't fully understand yet. I remember the excitement I felt moving into the dorms for the first time. The building itself wasn't anything special, just another brick structure with narrow windows and long hallways that echoed. But to me, it felt like the beginning of my real adult life. I arrived early in the morning on move-in day, dragging my boxes and duffel bags up the stairs. I was the first person in my dorm room. The door was propped open, sunlight streaming through the window and casting long rectangles of light across the empty tile floor. There were 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 dressers. Mine was on the right. His was on the left. I set my stuff down and claimed my side without hesitation. I had already contacted my assigned roommate weeks before, and we'd exchanged messages trying to coordinate who would bring what. Mini fridge, microwave, rug, fan, normal college room stuff. He seemed nice enough in writing, not super enthusiastic, but polite. We agreed on the basics. He said he'd arrive later in the afternoon, but he didn't. Not that day, not the next day, not all week. I sent him a couple of messages, nothing demanding, just checking in. No reply. I figured maybe something came up, or he was dealing with last-minute stuff. Freshman year is chaotic. I wasn't too worried about it. I was busy learning the campus layout, exploring buildings, buying overpriced textbooks, and trying to pretend I wasn't nervous about everything. Then, on the 8th day, exactly 1 week after move-in, I came back to the dorm after my last class of the day. My backpack was heavy, my brain was fried, and all I wanted was to sit down for a bit before tackling homework. I pushed the door open and froze. He was there. Sitting on the bed on the left, the bed that had been empty all week, was a guy. My roommate. Or at least I assumed it was him. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, except for the fact that he'd arrived without saying anything. I set my stuff down and walked toward him to say hi, try to restart the conversation we'd never begun. But as I got closer, something felt off. He looked terrible, pale, thin, washed out in a way that made me instinctively take half a step back. His cheeks were hollow, dark circles under his eyes so deep they looked bruised. The skin on his face was grayish, like he hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. If I saw someone who looked like that today, I'd assume they'd just come out of a hospital or were recovering from some serious illness. I didn't want to catch anything, so I kept a little distance. I tried to be friendly anyway. "Hey," I said lightly, "I'm glad you finally made it. He didn't look at me, not even a glance. He kept staring forward, eyes unfocused, as if he were looking at something far beyond the wall. When I spoke again, he made a soft grunt, not a real word, just a sound. I wasn't sure if it was acknowledgement or effort or pain. I forced a smile. "Everything okay? Need help with anything?" He didn't respond, didn't even blink. Then I noticed something strange. He hadn't brought anything with him. No suitcase, no backpack, no clothes, no toiletries, no supplies. Nothing we had talked about, nothing anyone would normally bring to college. He was wearing the same outfit he must have traveled in, jeans, a baggy shirt, and shoes that looked scuffed and worn. It was bizarre, but I was new to college life and I didn't want to make assumptions. Maybe his parents were bringing the rest later. Maybe he was having issues at home. Maybe something happened. I told myself not to judge, I unpacked my things and tried to go about my day, but things didn't improve. For the next week, he barely moved. Every morning when I woke up, he was sitting in the exact same position on the bed. Legs on the mattress, body slumped forward or leaned back against the wall, head drooping. Sometimes he looked asleep with his eyes half closed. Other times he just stared blankly into the corner of the room. I never saw him stand, not once. I never saw him leave the room during daylight, never saw him walk out the door to go to classes or to eat. I never saw him pick up a toothbrush, take a shower, or even stretch his legs. His posture looked uncomfortable, and yet he stayed locked in that same position for hours. The only evidence that he ever left the bed was at night. I'd fall asleep to the sound of rustling from his side of the room. Sometimes I'd hear the door click open or shut very quietly. Other times I'd wake up to find some of my things moved slightly. My textbooks weren't where I left them. My shoes were angled differently. A drawer I knew I had closed was slightly open. I told myself I must be misremembering. It was easier than admitting I was uncomfortable. Then the smell began. At first, it was faint, a kind of musty, sweaty odor like old laundry mixed with something sour. Dorms never smell great, so I brushed it off. But each day, the smell grew stronger and worse. It crawled through the room, thick and stale, settling into the air like a fog. I noticed his clothes looked dirty, the fabric stiff and wrinkled as if he'd been wearing them for days. His hair became greasy, his skin even more ashen than before. He looked like he was wasting away. His cheeks sank deeper. His eyes seemed duller, unfocused. His breathing was quiet and slow. He didn't have the strength to hold his head upright for long. Sometimes he drooped forward as if he might fall over. Every time I tried talking to him, he didn't answer. Not a grunt, not a nod. Nothing. By the 5th day of the smell being unbearable, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't study. I couldn't even be in the room for more than a few minutes without opening a window and spraying air freshener, neither of which helped. The smell was heavy, like something rotting. I started worrying he was sick, seriously sick. What if he was dying? What if something terrible was happening and I was just ignoring it? Finally, I went to the RA. I explained everything, how he never talked, never left, how the room reeked so badly I couldn't stay in it, how I didn't know if he needed help. The RA gave me a strange look, not annoyed, confused. He asked for the guy's name. I told him. He frowned, opened his computer, typed something, and shook his head slowly. "We're still looking for a roommate for you," he said. "The guy you were supposed to room with dropped out before the semester started." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "He's in my room right now." "There shouldn't be anyone in there," the RA said more firmly. "Nobody is assigned to that bed." I insisted, described him, explained his behavior, the smell, the clothes, everything. The RA's expression shifted from confusion to concern, then skepticism. He said maybe someone snuck into my room, maybe I'd misunderstood, maybe it was some weird prank. I told him it wasn't a prank. He sighed, stood up, and said we'd go check the room together. I expected to find the guy sitting on the bed like always, staring off like always. But when the RA opened the door, the room was empty. The bed, his bed, was a mess. Sheets wrinkled, blanket twisted, pillow dented where a head had been resting. The mattress was still indented, clearly used. And the smell, the overwhelming smell of rot, decay, sweat, and something worse, something sour and heavy that hit us the second the door opened. But the guy was gone, just gone. No sign of him leaving, no bag, no clothes, no trace except that reek that clung to the air and the outline his body had left in the bed. The RA stepped back, covering his nose, glaring at me like I had somehow caused this. He muttered something about cleanliness and sanitation and told me I should have asked for help sooner, even though I just had. I tried to explain again, but he didn't believe a word of it. not one. He thought I'd let someone disgusting into the room and hadn't reported it. He thought the stink was because of me. He thought the bed was filthy because I didn't clean properly. No matter what I said, he wouldn't believe me. I practically begged him to remove the mattress and bedding. Eventually he agreed, mostly because the stench was so overpowering he couldn't stand there anymore. I felt humiliated and terrified at the same time. Someone had been sleeping across from me for a week. Someone whose name I didn't know, someone I wasn't even sure was alive half the time, and he had vanished without a trace. That night, after the new mattress was delivered, I sat on my bed thinking about everything. Something made me want to call the original roommate, the one I was supposed to have, just to confirm, just to clear my head, just to know he hadn't randomly shown up without telling anyone. His mother answered. She recognized my voice immediately. We had spoken a couple times before the semester started. I asked her about him and explained everything that had happened. I told her he had shown up, stayed in the room for a week, acted strangely, then disappeared. The line went silent, completely silent. When she finally spoke again, her voice was strained, trembling with anger and grief. She told me her son had gotten very sick 3 weeks before school started. They took him to the hospital. He got worse, his body shut down, and he died. He was buried the previous weekend. She thought I was calling to torment her, to mock her loss somehow. She screamed at me, called me cruel, and hung up. I sat on my bed, frozen, staring at the phone in my hand. My heart hammered in my chest. My skin felt cold. My mouth went dry. The world around me felt suddenly unreal. If he had died 3 weeks before school started, if he never arrived on campus, if he was never assigned to my room, then who or what sat across from me for a week? I never called his mother again, and I never slept comfortably in that dorm room for the rest of the year. In 2018, during my time in Hawaii, there was a girl I really liked. She was easy to talk to, fun to be around, and had this calm presence that made everything feel lighter. I spent weeks debating whether I should ask her out. Finally, one warm evening, I gathered enough courage to ask if she wanted to go on a date with me. To my relief and surprise, she said yes. We went to a restaurant first, had some wine, talked, laughed. Everything felt easy between us. After dinner, neither of us wanted to end the night just yet. She suggested we go somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful. A beach, maybe. I mentioned Mokapu Beach, which isn't far from Honolulu. Not the most known spot for tourists, but quiet and beautiful at night. So around 11 p.m., we drove out there. The moment we stepped onto Mokapu Beach, everything felt still. Not threatening, just still. The air was warm with a hint of salt. The sky was cloudless, and the moon hung huge and bright over the water. The sand felt cool under our feet. There were no people around, no cars driving by, no music from distant bars. It felt like the entire beach belonged to us. We spread out a blanket on the sand and lay down side by side, listening to the waves roll in and out. We talked about our families, our childhoods, and the random things life had thrown at us. She told me about growing up on the mainland, and I told her how Hawaii already felt like a dream compared to where I came from. Hours passed without us noticing. We weren't tired. We weren't bored. Time floated by quietly. Around 2 a.m., everything shifted. The first strange thing happened slowly. We both felt something small brushing against our hands. It was gentle, almost like tiny feet or a soft tickle. We both reacted at the same moment, pulling our hands back slightly. "What was that?" she whispered. "I think crabs," I said, even though I wasn't convinced. The moon was full and bright. You could see the sand clearly, even far down the beach. I sat up, expecting to see crabs scurrying around. Hawaii has a lot of small shore crabs that come out at night. It would have made perfect sense, but there was nothing. Not a single crab, no movement, no shadows darting across the sand. We exchanged a confused look, but shrugged it off. Beaches have weird moments. Maybe the crabs had already run off. We lay back down, laughing a little at how jumpy we were, and tried to settle back into conversation. But not even a minute passed before we felt it again. A light brushing against our fingers, a tiny pat, like something with small hands was touching us. Not claws, hands. This time she jerked her hand away quickly. "That didn't feel like a crab," she said. I didn't answer, because she was right. It didn't feel like a crab at all. The pressure was too soft, too human-like, too intentional. Before we could make sense of it, a sound reached us. A sound that made both of us sit straight up in the sand. It was a baby crying. Not a cat, not the wind, not a bird. A baby, a real baby crying somewhere in the darkness. It echoed across the empty beach, high-pitched, panicked, and unmistakable. The kind of sound that instantly kicks your instincts into overdrive. Someone needs help. But this was 2 a.m. on a nearly abandoned beach, miles away from any houses. The nearest home was about 5 miles inland. She looked at me with wide eyes, fear spreading across her face. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I said quietly. The crying continued, rising and falling like a real infant's wail. We both turned toward the sound, scanning the area, expecting, hoping to see someone walking down the shoreline, or maybe another couple, or maybe a stranded family. But the beach was completely empty. Water, sand, moonlight, nothing else. We listened again. The crying grew louder, then softer, then louder again, like it was moving. We tried to convince ourselves it was a cat. Cats sometimes make crying sounds, but whenever we looked toward where the sound came from, there was no movement, no animal, nothing. Then, just as we tried to reassure ourselves, we felt the brushing on our hands again. This time, it lingered. She squeezed my arm. "Let's go," she whispered urgently. I didn't argue. We stood, gathered our things as quickly as we could, and walked back toward the parking lot. The crying faded behind us, but the feeling of being touched, those invisible tiny hands, stayed in the back of my mind the entire way. My chest felt tight. My heart beat harder than normal. Everything in me screamed that we were not supposed to be there anymore. When we finally reached the car, we both let out deep breaths we didn't even know we'd been holding. The moment I started the engine, we left Mokapu as fast as I could safely drive. For 2 months, I didn't think about it much. I chalked it up to crabs, to weird nighttime sounds, to nerves. Hawaii's nights play tricks on people sometimes. The darkness feels thicker there, the silence sharper. I didn't want to believe anything supernatural had happened. Then, 2 months later, everything changed. I was sitting in a hair salon getting a haircut. The stylist was a local woman in her early 40s who had lived on the island her whole life. We always ended up talking through the appointment, but that day our conversation turned to Hawaiian legends. Night marchers, burial grounds, cursed places you should never enter, the history tied to certain valleys. Eventually, she mentioned Mokapu. My ears perked up immediately. "What's so scary about Mokapu?" I asked casually, more out of curiosity than anything else. She paused before answering, lowering her voice slightly, even though it was just the two of us. "A long time ago," she said, "Hawaiians used to take deformed babies there." She hesitated, then continued. "They killed them at Mokapu. The beach was one of the places where unwanted or sick infants were taken. Locals say their spirits still linger. Some people claim that if you stay long enough, you'll hear them crying." A chill ran through my entire body. My scalp tingled even though she was touching it already. I felt every hair stand up, goosebumps creeping down my arms and legs. I thought she was just telling a legend, an old story, but then she added quietly, I heard it once myself, years ago, late at night, baby crying, clear as day, creepiest thing I've ever experienced. I swallowed hard, my throat felt tight. I wasn't sure whether to speak or stay silent, but the truth pushed its way out. I've been there, I heard the crying too. She froze. I explained exactly what had happened, the touching, the crying, the emptiness of the beach. As I spoke, she kept nodding slowly, not even surprised. Her face wasn't skeptical. It was sympathetic, almost relieved that someone else had experienced something similar. "You shouldn't go back there at night," she told me softly. "Some places hold memories too strong to fade." Until that moment, I had no idea about Mokapu's history. Nobody had told me anything. I hadn't read about it. I couldn't have imagined it. The story she told was something I learned after the experience, not before. Even now, years later, it still gives me chills. I can still remember the sound of the crying echoing across the beach. I can still feel the light touch of something small brushing against my hands in the dark. And I still think about the fact that neither of us saw anything, nothing living, nothing moving, nothing that could explain what we felt. Hawaii is beautiful, but its beauty is layered with old stories, long shadows, and spirits that linger longer than people expect. And I will never forget what happened that night on Mokapu Beach. This story takes place on the night of September 10th, 2001. Back then, I was in my final year of college. I lived off campus in a small apartment with uneven floors and a mattress that sagged in the middle. I didn't have early classes the next morning, so I stayed up late finishing a paper and then finally went to bed close to midnight. I wasn't stressed, I wasn't sick, nothing unusual happened that night. It was just a regular Monday evening, the kind you forget by the next day. And then I started dreaming. The first dream didn't begin the way most dreams do. There was no slow drift into darkness, no surreal transitions, no bizarre images that only make sense in a dream world. It felt real from the beginning, too real. I remember standing in a place I didn't recognize, watching an airplane fly low across the sky. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The aircraft looked wrong somehow, off course, shaky, as if the pilot had lost control. Then the plane slammed into a huge metal structure. It wasn't like a dream where things feel symbolic or distorted. The impact felt violent, loud, powerful enough that I felt the vibration in my chest. In the dream, the structure looked like a giant vertical train car, long and silver with rows of windows. My mind couldn't make sense of it. Why was a train standing upright? Why were there so many windows so high off the ground? Before I could process it, the screaming started. It wasn't faint, it wasn't dreamlike. It was sharp, raw, full of terror. The kind of screaming that snaps you awake because your brain can't handle the sound any other way. I shot up in bed, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I remember looking around my dark room, half expecting to see fire outside my window or smoke rising somewhere nearby. It took me almost an hour to calm down, to slow my breathing, to remind myself that I had just dreamed something awful. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep again, but the exact same dream came back. Same airplane, same metal structure, same confused moment where it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. Same explosion, same glass shattering, same people screaming, and once again, the dream yanked me. Awake at the exact same moment, as if my mind couldn't let me see anything more. This time, the panic took longer to shake off. Almost 2 hours passed before my breathing returned to normal. I remember lying on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that dreams repeat sometimes, that stress can do strange things, that none of it meant anything. But some part of me didn't believe that. Something deep inside me knew the dream wasn't normal. When I eventually drifted into sleep again, I had one last dream, different from the first two, but just as vivid and disturbing. In this dream, I saw people floating in the air. At first, it was almost beautiful. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people drifting above the ground like they were flying. Not in airplanes, not on gliders or parachutes, just flying. Arms outstretched like superheroes, bodies moving through the sky effortlessly. They looked happy. They were smiling, weaving through the air as if they were swimming in sunlight. Everything felt warm and peaceful, almost joyful. Then suddenly they stopped. The joy vanished. Every one of them froze in midair, as if an invisible force had grabbed hold of them. Their faces changed instantly from happiness to horror. Then they all began to fall. Not glide, not float, fall fast. I could see their arms flailing, their expressions twisted in panic, their mouths open in screams that sounded exactly like the ones from the first dream. The moment they began to fall, the screaming grew so loud and so real that it tore me awake. I sat upright in bed again, heart hammering, feeling like I had witnessed something terrible. After that dream, I barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined people falling and screaming. I kept seeing that huge metal structure, those windows, and that plane. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, mentally foggy and shaken. I didn't have an early class, so I stayed in bed a little longer. Around 9:30 a.m., my girlfriend called. I remember her voice sounded frantic, almost out of breath. She told me to turn on the TV, that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. I'll admit something that some people might find strange. Before that day, I didn't really know what the World Trade Center looked like. I grew up far from New York, and I'd never paid much attention to the skyline. I'd heard the name, but I had no memory of what the buildings actually looked like. So when I turned on the TV, I didn't know what to expect. But the moment I saw the towers, long silver gray, full of windows, my chest tightened. They looked exactly like the structure in my dream. Not kind of like it, exactly like it. My confusion from the night before suddenly made sense. I had been seeing something real but didn't recognize it at the time. Then I saw footage of people falling, not flying, not drifting, falling, arms out, bodies tumbling, and every image on the TV screen connected wordlessly with the dreams I'd had just hours before. My stomach dropped. My hands started shaking. I turned the volume down because I couldn't bear to hear the screaming, real or imagined. The guilt hit me instantly. Not guilt because I caused anything. I'm not delusional. I know dreams don't create reality. But guilt because I had seen something so similar the night before and had done nothing. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't believe what I saw. I spent weeks wrestling with those thoughts. I didn't sleep well. I had nightmares every night. Faces falling through the sky, planes crashing, screams waking me up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I was still dreaming. Other times I'd avoid sleep altogether because I was terrified of seeing those images again. By mid-semester, I was barely functioning. I stopped going to certain classes. My grades tanked. My motivation completely collapsed. I couldn't focus on anything academic because the dreams and the reality kept looping in my mind like a broken film reel. I felt haunted, not by spirits or ghosts, but by the idea that I had glimpsed something impossible and then lived through it in real life. I eventually failed multiple classes. I withdrew from others. It should have been my senior year, the final stretch before graduating, but instead, I barely made it through the first half of the semester. Years passed before I could talk about it at all, and even now, it's hard. I've tried telling myself it was a coincidence, that dreams borrow images from news and stress and subconscious fears, but that explanation never felt convincing. Not because I want to believe something supernatural happened, but because the dreams were too clear, too precise, too close to the truth of what unfolded the next morning. And the screams, those are what stayed with me the longest, the way they sounded exactly the same in my dream and on TV. Even now, when I think about it, my chest gets tight and I feel that same cold fear I felt waking up in that small apartment. It honestly feels strange, but also relieving to write this all down. Maybe it doesn't matter whether people believe me or not. Maybe the point is just finally letting this story exist somewhere outside my own head. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't make the tragedy any less horrific. But after carrying it alone for so long, it feels lighter somehow to share it with strangers who don't know me, who won't judge me the way people in my real life might. If you've read all of this, thank you. I still wish none of it were true, but it is, and I still dream about it sometimes. About 3 weekends ago, me and 3 old high school friends, Mike, John, and Alex, decided to go camping in Huntsville National Forest in Texas. We do this kind of trip at least once a year. We've camped in Arizona and Colorado, right near the Spanish Peaks, and even deep in New Mexico. We like going far off the trail, living off whatever we can catch or trap, and spending a few days without phones, lights, or noise. We've never had anything happen that was too crazy. Strange sounds at night, sure. Coyotes, bears, raccoons, normal wildlife stuff. We always considered ourselves pretty experienced. This year, it was my turn to pick the spot, and I chose Huntsville. More specifically, near New Waverly, where you can get pretty deep into the forest without bumping into anyone for miles. We drove up early in the morning, parked our car in one of the designated areas, grabbed our packs, and headed straight into the trees. The air was humid but cool. We spent the first stretch of our hike laughing, catching each other up on our lives, joking about college stories. It felt good, familiar. We walked until the sunlight faded through the branches and the forest grew quiet. We stopped at a clearing and set up camp. As usual, we made a fire, put up the tent, and sat around telling creepy stories. That was our tradition. Every trip, as soon as the sun went down, we tried to scare each other with ghost stories, creature myths, weird encounters, whatever we could come up with. It never worked, at least not in any serious way. This time was different. While we were adding wood to the fire, we started to smell something faint. Not strong, not unpleasant, just noticeable. It was like catching a whiff of something dead far away, a thin, stale scent that drifted in and out. We tried to place it, but none of us could. It didn't smell like an animal carcass. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled like something old, something sick. We shrugged it off. About half an hour later, Mike stood up to go take a piss in the woods. He walked off a little way with his flashlight, muttering stuff about how none of us better follow him and mess with him. A few seconds later, he came crashing back through the trees, flashlight shaking wildly in his hand. His jeans were soaked with piss, like he'd gotten startled midstream and didn't aim. We all burst out laughing. We thought he slipped or saw a raccoon. But the moment we saw his face, the laughter died instantly. Mike looked like he'd seen something that drained the blood out of him. White as paper, shaking so violently he could barely hold the flashlight. He didn't explain. He just screamed at us, come on, follow me, now." We all froze. Mike was the toughest of us. Nothing scared him. If something rattled him, it was bad. We grabbed our lights, but he had the only one with him. The rest of our gear was still by the fire. We didn't want to split up, so we ran with him through the woods, following the frantic beam of his flashlight. As we ran, we began hearing something in the distance, crying, screaming. At first it sounded far away, but as we kept running, it grew louder, the kind of crying that sounded desperate, like someone couldn't breathe between sobs. It echoed through the trees. A thin, ragged voice. We slowed down when we reached a clearing. There was a cabin there, old, falling apart, covered in moss, mildew, rotting wood. It looked abandoned except for one thing. There was a faint light coming from one of the grime-covered windows. The crying was coming from inside. At this point, none of us were smiling. None of us were joking. We stood at the door, listening to the choking sobs coming from the other side. Mike swallowed hard and knocked. The crying stopped instantly. Silence, thick, heavy silence. Then, thud. Something enormous slammed against the inside of the door. Hard enough that the wood shook and dust fell from the frame. Then we heard a bolt slide open, but the door didn't move. We backed away a little. We waited. Mike knocked again. Nothing. John knocked again. Still nothing. Just that horrible smell, stronger now, like something dead and wet. We circled the cabin, refusing to split up even for a second. On the far side, we saw a window high up, covered in webs and dirt. Alex volunteered to look inside. He was breathing heavily but trying to act brave. Me and Mike lifted him up slowly. We watched him wipe away some dust, lean forward and press his face to the glass. There was silence for 1 second, 2 seconds. Then Alex inhaled sharply, so sharply it sounded like he lost all the air in his chest at once. And he screamed. Not a startled scream, a scream of pure animal fear. He fell backward, crashing onto the ground, kicking and scrambling like he was trying to crawl out of his own skin. We all grabbed him, trying to get him to breathe, but he punched, clawed, screamed, and kept trying to run. His face was twisted with terror. We dragged him back to camp. The fire had burned low, so I threw wood on it, with shaking hands, needing something to do, anything to keep my brain grounded. Alex was hysterical, shaking, sobbing, babbling nonsense. Every few minutes he woke up from fainting and screamed again. None of us slept. We stayed up around the fire until sunrise, flinching at every sound, every shift of wind, every crack of a twig. The forest didn't feel like a forest anymore. It felt like something was watching us. When the sun finally rose, me and Mike went back to find the cabin, except it wasn't there. Nothing was there. No clearing, no foundation, no wood, no walls, no sign anything had ever stood there. But the smell was stronger, heavy, decaying, wrong. When we returned, Alex looked worse. He had chewed into the sides of his own mouth in the night, so much that blood had run down his chin and dried there. John looked half dead from exhaustion. Alex was shaking violently. He whispered, "We need to leave, now." We started packing when the sky suddenly grew dark. Thick clouds rolled in fast. Within seconds, rain was pouring down, like someone had dumped buckets of water from the sky. Alex panicked. He grabbed a huge stick, waving it at us. "If you don't leave everything and go right now," he screamed, "I'll knock you out and drag you." Mike yelled back at him, and they nearly fought before we separated them and finished packing. We pushed through the rain until we reached a creek we had crossed the day before. A small stream then, but now swollen with violent water, too dangerous to cross. That's when Alex lost it. He screamed at Mike for not packing faster, screamed that the cabin was coming, screamed that he saw something behind the trees. We forced him to breathe, forced him to sit, and finally begged him to tell us what he saw in the window. His face went blank. His voice dropped to a whisper. When I looked inside, a face looked back at me. He swallowed. It matched my movement. When I leaned in, it leaned in too, and it smiled. His voice cracked. It had black eyes, a mouth too big. It kept smiling wider and wider, and then a shadow behind it lifted something, an axe or a blade, and it cut the face off. He trembled violently now. The skin stuck to the window, and the face, the cut-off face, laughed. It slid down the glass, laughing. We all stared at him. Even Mike looked shaken, though he tried to hide it. Then something floated past us in the creek. A doll, a soaked, mud-covered baby doll. Then another, then another. Old Barbie dolls, baby dolls, all worn, sun-faded, waterlogged, dozens of them drifting by like they'd been released upstream. Mike picked one up. It had a voice chip inside. It made a broken gurgling noise, then a warped laugh. Then it whispered something unintelligible. Mike threw it down instantly. We walked along the creek, searching for a safe place to cross. Shadows moved behind trees. At first, we all called bullshit on each other. Then we all saw it. All felt eyes on us. The sun dipped low, and then the cabin was suddenly in front of us again, right where it didn't exist an hour earlier. Mike snapped, "This is bullshit. I'm going inside." We begged him not to. Alex grabbed him, but Mike shook him off. Before he could step forward, we heard the dolls again. Hundreds, laughing, whispering, singing, all from somewhere deep in the trees. We ran. Didn't talk. Didn't think. We just ran. The smell grew stronger. Decaying sweetness mixed with wet earth. Something screamed in the woods. Something else cried. The rain hammered down. We crossed the creek somehow. I don't even remember how. We reached the car exhausted, shaking, soaked to the bone. We drove without speaking except our own heavy breathing and the sound of the wipers. We almost reached the freeway when the road was closed for construction. A detour sign pointed down a narrow dirt road leading back into the woods. We turned toward it. A girl appeared. Young, pretty, long hair plastered to her face from the rain. She stumbled towards the car like she was hurt. She reached the passenger side. Her eyes were unfocused, her mouth slightly open. Alex didn't roll down the window. He locked the door instantly. The girl put her face right against the glass and smiled. Too wide, much too wide. We drove, fast. Mike screamed. Alex cried. John prayed. I don't remember breathing at all. We eventually found a road and floored it all the way back to Houston. When we reached my apartment, we didn't speak. We split without saying goodbye. That night, Mike texted me, "I'm going back." I begged him not to. He said it was all in our heads. A trick of fear, a shared hallucination, something explainable. He stopped replying after that, and now, I don't know if the cabin is real. I don't know if the girl was real. I don't know if what we saw followed us back. All I know is that I've never been that scared in my life. And something tells me the forest isn't done with us. There's a small town in the suburbs west of Chicago called West Chicago. I spent a lot of time there growing up. It isn't remarkable in the way some towns are. No famous landmarks, no big attractions, nothing that makes people stop and stare. But like a lot of quiet Midwestern towns, it has its secrets. Old buildings, worn-out homes, forgotten corners where strange things linger long after everyone else has moved on. There was a small church there that I can't remember the name of anymore. Just a simple, modest structure with a gravel parking lot and a white wooden cross out front. Nothing about the church itself was frightening. If anything, it looked cheerful. Fresh paint on the outside, windows that glowed warmly at night when services were held, a perfectly trimmed lawn overseen by older members of the congregation. But next to the church was a small house that the church owned, and that house was a completely different story. Friends of mine rented it for a while. They were young like me, teenagers with jobs, school, and far too much curiosity for our own good. The first time they invited me over, they warned me that the house was weird. Not haunted, not dangerous, just weird. They said it always felt cold even with the heat on, and that sometimes they heard noises they couldn't explain. I brushed it off. Teenagers exaggerate everything. I figured the place was old and drafty, and that was that. But they weren't exaggerating. The house was creepy from the moment I walked inside. Not the kind of creepy with ghosts or shadows or obvious threats. Just a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that clung to you like humidity. Upstairs was tolerable, almost normal. The bedrooms were small but bright enough. A couple posters on the walls, clothes on the floor, a lamp that flickered sometimes. Nothing particularly unsettling, but the first floor was worse. Every step down the stairs made the house feel older. The wallpaper was faded, peeling at the edges, the kind that looked like it had soaked up 40 years of cigarette smoke, even though no one living there smoked. The windows didn't let in much light. The floor creaked loudly no matter how lightly you walked. Something about the air felt stale, as if it had been trapped in the house for decades. But nothing could have prepared me for the basement. The basement was the worst place I have ever stood in my entire life. Even now, just thinking about it makes the back of my neck tighten. Some places feel bad the moment you see them, as if something inside you recognizes danger before your brain can explain it. That basement was one of those places. The layout of the house was small, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. When you opened the narrow basement door, wooden stairs led straight down the center. There were no walls in the basement, no rooms, just a large, open concrete space broken only by support beams and shadows. It was damp, so damp that you could smell the moisture, rising before you even reached the bottom step. The air felt cold, thick, almost slimy. The single hanging light bulb barely lit anything beyond a few feet around it. The rest of the basement stretched into murky darkness, where old objects sat half covered in dust and cobwebs. The first object that always struck people was impossible to miss: the guts of a piano leaning against the far wall. Not a full piano, not a broken one, just the inside mechanism, the strings, hammers, wooden frame, all exposed. It looked like someone had torn a piano apart and kept only the skeleton. The metal strings ran vertically, rusted, dusty, eerie. The entire thing stood propped up like a shrine or warning. The first time I went down there, a few of us teenagers went together because none of us wanted to go alone. One of the girls who had been to the basement before told us to look at the piano. Then she ran her hand across the strings. The sound that came out didn't sound like music. It didn't sound like anything that should come from an instrument. It was jagged, discordant, metallic. A horrible scraping vibration that made my skin crawl instantly. It echoed through the basement like something waking up. I screamed. 2 others screamed. We didn't even laugh about it afterward. We just ran up the stairs so fast we nearly tripped over each other. But as terrifying as that was, it wasn't the worst part of the basement. The worst part was the small room in the far corner. Calling it a room barely describes it. It looked like something hastily built after the house was originally completed, an addition someone made to hide something, or confine something. The walls were wooden, old planks roughly hammered together. It was maybe 5 feet by 5 feet, a perfect cube. There was a low bench attached to each of the side walls, like the kind you might see in a holding cell. The wooden boards were worn but still visible through the dust. No pillows, no blankets, nothing to soften the space. Just 2 benches facing each other in silence. But what made it horrifying were the locks. There were 5 heavy deadbolts on the outside of the door, not on the inside, on the outside, along with chains, metal latches, reinforced screws, layers and layers of ways to keep something inside. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure whatever or whoever was in that room couldn't get out. And this was in the basement of a house where members of the church clergy had lived for years. I remember standing several feet away from it the first time, staring. Something inside me kept whispering, "Don't go closer, don't touch the door, don't even breathe near it." It wasn't just the locks, it was the feeling. Every instinct told me the room had held something terrible, something human, something suffering, something angry. The room didn't feel empty, even though it obviously was. Everyone who went down there felt the same thing, that the air inside that Basement wasn't just damp, it was sick, heavy with something unseen. A few of the braver kids once tried to open the little locked room, but the bolts were too rusted, too tight. Maybe that was for the best. Every time I visited that house afterward, I avoided the basement completely. Even walking past the door that led down the stairs made my stomach twist. The renters joked about the basement at first. They tried to laugh about it, tease each other, make it into a fun haunted house story. But eventually, even they stopped going down there. They said the house felt better when the basement door stayed locked. One of them once confessed to me that he sometimes heard noises under the floor at night, soft tapping, scratching, slow dragging sounds. But he refused to open that door and check. They moved out not long after, not because anything dramatic happened, not because the house attacked them, but because the place wore them down. They said the air upstairs felt strange. The walls creaked too often. Shadows moved when they shouldn't. They had nightmares they didn't want to describe, and the basement always felt alive somehow, like the piano strings might vibrate even without anyone touching them, like the little room might shift, settling or breathing. After they moved out, the house sat empty. Last I heard, the church still owns it, but no one lives there anymore. The basement is still down there, still dark, still damp, still holding whatever stories the clergy never spoke about. I've seen scary movies, I've read horror novels. None of them compare to standing in that basement, staring at a room small enough to sit in, but terrifying enough to ruin sleep for weeks. Some places feel haunted not because of ghosts, but because of what people did inside them. And I still think about that 5x5 room, locked from the outside, and wonder what the church needed to keep in there. And why. Story 7. Berkeley, California has a strange kind of charm to it. Old trees, quiet streets, charming homes pressed close together, porch lights glowing at night. Everything feels safe, calm, almost too peaceful for anything truly frightening to happen. That's what everyone tells themselves when they move there. That's what this particular family believed when they bought their house on a leafy residential street. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved, joggers passed by every morning, and children played outside until sunset without anyone worrying. The family had 2 children, a 6-year-old girl and her 4-year-old brother. They were energetic, happy, imaginative kids, always drawing pictures of animals, talking about cartoons, and running around the yard with sticky hands from popsicles. They were good kids, just easily spooked like many children their age. Especially by one thing, the monster in their bedroom closet. The parents had heard the story many times. Some nights the kids insisted they heard scratching. Other nights they swore someone whispered their names. Sometimes they cried out in the dark, saying that the closet door moved on its own or that they could see a shadow under it. The parents checked the closet dozens of times. Nothing was there, not even a draft that could explain the noises. Like many parents, they chalked it up to childhood fear, imagination, shadows, a creaky old house, nothing more. One Saturday night, the parents had dinner plans, something they didn't get to enjoy often. They hired a babysitter, a college student named Marissa, who lived down the street. She'd watched the kids a few times before and knew the routine. Dinner at 7, baths by 8, bedtime shortly after. She was friendly, patient, good with kids, and the children liked her. Before leaving, the parents gave her one extra piece of advice. The kids might talk about a monster in the closet. They get worked up about it sometimes. Just calm them down, check the closet to reassure them, and send them back to bed. Marissa laughed lightly. She'd handled kids scared of the dark before. "No problem," she said. "I'll take care of it." The parents left. The house quieted, and everything seemed normal at first. Dinner went smoothly. Bath time was full of splashing and giggles. By bedtime, the kids were yawning, clinging to their favorite stuffed animals. Marissa tucked them in, read a short story, kissed them on the forehead, and turned off the light. The soft glow of the hallway nightlight spilled into the room. Downstairs, she settled onto the couch, flipped through channels, and let herself relax. Babysitting was easy money when everything went right. It didn't go right. Maybe an hour passed before she heard small footsteps on the stairs. She looked up to see the 4-year-old boy standing at the bottom step, rubbing one eye with his tiny fist. "What's wrong, buddy?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then whispered, "The monster in the closet is awake." Marissa remembered what the parents told her. She smiled reassuringly. "There's no such thing as monsters. Come on, let's go tuck you back in." She carried him upstairs. The hallway felt a little colder than before, but she didn't think much of it. She placed him gently into bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and turned toward the closet. "See? Nothing scary," she said as she opened it. The closet was filled with little clothes hanging neatly, tiny shirts, jackets, dresses, a row of shoes on the floor. Normal, completely normal. She crouched to check under the bed too, just to show the boy everything was safe. "All clear," she said. "You're okay." The child nodded, but his eyes didn't completely relax. Still, he lay back down, and Marissa headed downstairs. She had barely settled onto the couch again when she heard footsteps once more. Softer this time, hesitant, and when she looked up, he was there again, trembling, his face pale. "The monster came back," he whispered. Marissa sighed softly, more tired than irritated. Kids his age had wild imaginations. She stood, stretched her back, and walked him upstairs again. As they got closer to the bedroom, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. The closet light was on. She hadn't turned it on earlier, she was certain. The door was closed, but a thin, bright strip of light glowed under the gap at the bottom. That alone was strange enough. But then she saw something that made her freeze halfway through her next step. Two shadows. Two human-shaped shadows stood behind the door, each a pair of legs about 3 feet apart. Perfectly still. Perfectly dark. Perfectly wrong. At first, she thought it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe furniture casting a weird shape. Maybe her eyes playing tricks on her. But the shadows were too distinct. Too real. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed both kids, one arm around the boy, the other reaching for the girl, who had woken up and was now staring silently at the closet. Marissa didn't even pause to think. Her instincts screamed, "Run!" She hurried the kids down the stairs, nearly slipping in her panic. Once outside, she ran with them straight across the lawn toward the neighbor's house. Her hands shook as she pounded on the door. "Call 911, she gasped. "Someone's inside." The neighbor brought them inside, locked the door, grabbed the phone, and called the police. While they waited, the kids clung to Marissa, trembling. She held them tight, shaking herself. Neither spoke, neither cried. They just listened to the silence outside, terrified of what had been in that closet. When the police arrived, Marissa went with them back to the house. Officers swept the home quickly, room by room, closet by closet. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No open windows. Nothing missing. No footprints inside. No hiding places disturbed. The closet light, the one she saw shining brightly less than 20 minutes earlier, was now off. The officers exchanged looks, half concerned, half skeptical. But then one of them noticed something odd by the edge of the backyard, a trail of crushed grass leading toward the trees. A few minutes later, another officer shouted, "Found someone!" They located an older man crouched in the bushes at the edge of the property, wearing a full clown suit, a bright, colorful clown suit, even though it was past midnight. His face was painted. His hair was a frizzy rainbow wig. He held a balloon in one hand, deflated and limp. His clothes were dirty, stained from crawling in the bushes. His eyes were wide and glassy, like he wasn't fully aware of where he was. They tackled him, cuffed him, and dragged him into the open. The kids started screaming. Marissa held them close, her heart pounding so hard she felt sick. Later, the police discovered that the man had escaped from a psychiatric facility a few towns away. He had a history of breaking into homes but had never harmed anyone, yet. He had an obsession with children and with closets. Doctors said he thought closets were gateways, though no one knew exactly what that meant. The family never stayed in that house again. And for years afterward, Marissa couldn't babysit without checking every closet first, not once, but twice or 3 times. She said she still remembers the moment she noticed the light on, the moment she saw the 2 shadows under the door, the moment she realized the kids hadn't imagined the monster in their closet at all. They had been telling the truth. Something really had been standing there in the dark, watching, waiting, and smiling behind the door. When my fiancé and I first moved into our apartment in San Diego, we were excited in the same way most young couples are when they start a new chapter. It was 2 months before I would begin school, and everything felt like it was lining up for us. The place wasn't perfect, but it had a certain charm. Sunlight came through the windows in the afternoon. The kitchen was small but cozy, and the bathroom, though old, looked clean enough. I had a bit of a habit whenever I toured new places. I always checked under the sinks for mold, because I'd had bad experiences in the past. So I bent down, opened the cabinet doors, and looked carefully. I checked the top, the sides, the base, even the corners. There was nothing, no mold, no weird stains, no forgotten items, just empty space and old wood. I felt good about it, and we signed the papers. We moved in the next day, excited and hopeful. About a week later, I got a text message from my girlfriend that I still remember vividly because of the way it came out of nowhere. She didn't sound angry at first. She sounded strangely calm, almost too calm, which made it worse. The message read, "Who the fuck are you cheating on me with?" I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to figure out if she was joking, if she sent it to the wrong person, or if she found something that made her think I was hiding something. When I asked her what she meant, she explained that she had found a makeup bag under the bathroom sink. I told her I checked everything thoroughly before we moved in, and there was definitely nothing there. She insisted it wasn't new makeup either. She knew cosmetics like an expert, and she said everything in that bag was from the 90s. Outdated brands and old packaging styles she recognized instantly. I couldn't explain it. There was no way I could. I hadn't seen it when I checked, and I certainly didn't put it there. We argued a little, but eventually we let it go. We wanted to believe it was just something the previous tenants left behind, and we somehow missed. We moved on with life, though a small, uncomfortable feeling lingered quietly somewhere in the back of my mind. We had a small indoor fountain in our bedroom, and at the base of it were tiny decorative rocks. We liked the sound of the water at night. It made the room peaceful and helped us sleep better. One day, maybe around 2 weeks after the makeup bag incident, I walked into the bathroom and found one of those small rocks right in front of the sink. It stood out because it didn't belong there and couldn't have gotten there on its own. I picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and put it aside. But I didn't really think much about it, at least not consciously. I assumed maybe it stuck to my sock, or maybe Chico, my elderly cat, played with it. But Chico doesn't run. He barely walks fast. He's old, calm, and slow. I've seen him lie in one spot for hours like a tiny furry statue. Still, I avoided overthinking it. Life was busy, and I didn't have the energy to question every little odd thing. Then came the night that changed the way I looked at that apartment forever. My fiancé and I were snuggled up in bed, comfortable and half asleep. Everything was quiet except for the soft sound of the fountain in the corner. As I started drifting, I suddenly felt a pressure at the foot of the bed, not like the blanket shifting or the mattress adjusting. This felt like the weight of a person sitting down. It wasn't subtle either. It was clear, intentional, and real enough that I opened my eyes instantly. Before I could fully process what I felt, I heard movement coming from our closet. The closet door was closed, so the noise had that muffled, enclosed quality to it. But what struck me was the pattern of the sound. You can always tell when something moving is a pet or a person. Cats make quick, light noises. Humans move differently. Weight shifts differently. The rhythm is different. What I heard sounded human. I turned to look for Chico, thinking maybe he was somehow behind the sound after all. But he wasn't near the closet. Instead, he was running straight toward me from that direction, as fast as I had ever seen him move in his life. His eyes were wide, his body low, and he sprinted like something terrified him. He practically launched himself onto the bed, and that alone was alarming. Chico never runs, not ever. The noises in the closet continued for a moment, and I muttered, "What the fuck?" under my breath as I got out of bed. My heart was beating hard, not out of panic, but because my brain couldn't form a normal explanation for what was happening. I opened the closet door quickly, expecting to find something, a fallen hanger, a box that tipped, anything. But the closet was empty, still and silent. I felt a rush of cold air that didn't match the temperature of the rest of the room. My fiancée, wide awake now, suggested we try doing an EVP session. She'd been interested in paranormal investigations for years, and she had a voice recorder app ready on her phone. I hesitated at first. I never thought of myself as someone who looked for ghosts or spirits. But after what we had just experienced, I didn't feel stupid for trying. So I turned on the recorder and asked, "Why are you going through our closet?" My voice sounded shaky even to me. I turned it off after a few seconds. When we played it back, we heard something that wasn't either of us. At first it was quiet, hard to understand. But when I turned the volume up, a voice came through. It sounded soft, distant, but clear enough. It said, "I swear it was here." Those words made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like a glitch. It didn't sound like background noise. It sounded like a person speaking in frustration or confusion. My fiancé looked at me with wide eyes, and I didn't have anything to say. About 3 days later, something else happened. My fiancée was taking a bath while I was in the other room. Suddenly she screamed my name, her voice high and trembling. I ran in to find her crying, shaking, holding her arms close to her chest. I asked what was wrong, and she told me the shower curtain had moved. Not a small shift from steam or airflow. She said it jerked, as if someone pulled it or brushed against it. It took a long time for her to calm down. After she settled, I decided to try another EVP. I turned on my phone and asked 3 questions. Who are you? How old are you? And are you here alone? I hit stop and played it back. The first answer was mumbled, unclear, almost like someone trying to speak through water. But the answer to the second question came through clearly. A small voice said, 8. Then another voice, older sounding, answered, no. That moment made the room feel colder. My fiancée looked at me like she wanted to leave the apartment that night. In the following weeks, things only got stranger. Several times a day, in every room of the apartment, we began seeing flashes of white light, quick streaks that moved from the floor to about chest height before disappearing in an instant. It didn't matter if it was day or night. They would appear near the hallway, the living room, the bedroom. Sometimes they were small, like a reflection, and sometimes larger, like a soft shape passing through the air. About 2 weeks after the bath incident, something happened to me in the shower. I was standing away from the water, just soaping up, when I felt something blow into my ear. It wasn't a faint breeze either. It felt like someone leaned in close and exhaled directly into my ear, strong enough that I felt the warmth and the pressure of it. I jumped so hard I nearly fell. I ran out of the shower dripping wet and stood in my room trying to catch my breath. I didn't want to go back in. I didn't even want to be alone in that bathroom. Odd things kept happening after that. Objects moved when we weren't looking. Small things went missing, only to appear in random places later. Lights turned on even after we were sure we'd turned them off. The most consistent thing was the bathroom door. Every single night before bed, I made a point to shut it. I would close it firmly, sometimes even push on it twice to make sure it latched. But every morning, without fail, we found it wide open and the bathroom light on. It became a routine, a frightening one. Some nights I lay awake wondering if I would hear the door open, but I never did. It always happened silently. Even now, the apartment still gives me that strange feeling. We're living with something we can't see and can't understand. Something that moves our things, opens our door, and answers our questions in voices that don't belong to anyone living. And despite all that's happened, we still don't know what it wants, where it came from, or why it chose our home. My aunt's husband came from a family that owned a funeral home long before any of us were born, long before even our grandparents were around. The place had been standing since before the Civil War and during the Battle of Antietam, when chaos swept through the area and wounded soldiers filled every available building. The funeral home also served as a makeshift hospital. The history of that house felt heavy even before you stepped inside. If you stood outside on a quiet afternoon, you could almost imagine the echo of wagons rolling up the old dirt road, the muffled voices of soldiers and the cold metal of Civil War tools clattering somewhere inside. It wasn't a place built for comfort. It was built for handling grief, suffering, and death, and it carried those memories in a way that didn't fade even with time. After the war ended and the decades moved forward, the house continued operating as a funeral home until around 1970. By then, the world had changed, and the business had moved to a new building farther into town. That old house finally stopped seeing daily work. It became quiet, almost too quiet, like it didn't know what to do with itself without people coming in and out, carrying the weight of their sorrow. That was when my uncle's brother decided to move into it. From what I was told, he didn't move there because he loved the place. He just needed somewhere to stay, and the house was empty. He lived alone, which already sounds uncomfortable when you imagine wandering through old hallways that had seen more bodies than most hospitals. He only stayed for about a year, and during that year he had an experience that scared him so deeply he never set foot inside the house again. He was upstairs one day taking a shower. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing special, and he wasn't thinking about ghosts or history or anything strange. But while he was showering, he heard a noise, something rattling just outside the curtain. It wasn't the soft kind of noise a pipe makes or the creak of old floorboards shifting in the heat. It sounded deliberate, like something or someone was moving around. When he pulled the shower curtain back to check, he didn't see a person standing there, but he did see a shadow, something shaped like a figure moving across the bathroom. The sunlight coming through the window didn't explain it, and the shadow didn't match anything in the room. That moment sent pure panic through him. He didn't stop to dry off or think. He ran straight out of the house, completely naked, sprinted through the yard, jumped into his car, and drove all the way to his parents' house without even stopping to grab clothes or shoes. Nobody convinced him to go back. He moved out shortly after and refused to talk much about it again. Fast forward to the mid-1980s when my aunt and uncle decided to move into that same house. My mother and my aunt were extremely close back then, more like sisters than in-laws, and because of that, she often visited them on weekends. I was always tagging along, young enough to find the world big, interesting, and mysterious, and old enough to remember the feeling of that house, even now. The house itself looked like a place where time had stopped. The front porch sagged a little, the stairs creaked loudly under your weight, and the hallways had long, narrow boards that groaned every time someone stepped on them. The light never seemed bright enough, no matter how many lamps were turned on. There was always a faint smell of old wood, dust, and something else I couldn't name back then. Something like the scent of untouched rooms and forgotten memories. The attic was our favorite place to play, even though looking back now I cannot understand why. You had to climb a steep set of wooden stairs that always seemed colder than the rest of the house, and when you opened the door, the smell of old fabric, varnish, and aged metal hit your nose immediately. The room was large but cluttered with objects from decades before. There were boxes stacked in corners, old furniture with sheets draped over them, and most strangely of all, more coffins than I could count. Some were wooden with carved details, some metal, and some were simple plain ones that looked unfinished. As kids, we didn't process the reality of what coffins meant. To us, they were props for pretend haunted houses. We would hide inside them, jump out to scare each other, giggle as the hinges squeaked, and run around the room imagining stories that fit the eerie atmosphere. The attic windows were small and covered in dust, letting in beams of light that always looked hazy. When the wind blew, the whole space made soft moaning noises, as if the house were breathing. At the time, none of that seemed disturbing. Children don't question the things adults quietly avoid. But I do remember being afraid of the basement. The stairway leading down felt darker than anything upstairs, even during the day. At the bottom of the steps was a wide room full of old embalming tools and equipment from when the house was still a funeral home. Metal tables, jars, strange clamps, long hoses, and cabinets full of things I didn't understand. Everything had a cold feel to it. Even just leaning into the stairwell made the hair on my arms stand up. I never wanted to explore down there, not even with my cousins beside me. My aunt and uncle didn't live there for very long, and I didn't know why at first. Adults usually keep their reasons private when children are around, but as I grew older, the pieces of the story started fitting together. My aunt eventually shared that one of the reasons she left the house was because she had heard a woman singing softly in the attic. Not a loud voice, not frightening, just gentle singing drifting down from above her. She said it happened at night when she was alone downstairs, and the sound was faint, like someone was humming an old lullaby through a closed door. At first, she thought it must be her imagination or a sound coming from outside, but the more she listened, the clearer it became that it was coming from inside the attic. She never went upstairs to check. She didn't want to see anything, not even to reassure herself. When she told my uncle's family about this, they didn't act surprised. Instead, they shared a story she had never heard before. In the years before the Civil War, a young slave child had died, and because nobody would pay for his burial, his body was embalmed and left in a coffin in the attic. It stayed there for some time until a woman, a stranger from what I understand, came and paid for his burial out of her own pocket. My aunt believed the singing she heard belonged to that woman, as if she had lingered in the house caring for the child even after death. My cousin later admitted that she had heard the same woman's voice from her bedroom, which had stairs leading directly to the attic. She said it softly, almost whispering, as if the memory still made her uneasy. I didn't think much about it as a child, but as I grew older, those memories came back in a different light. I remembered how certain corners of the house always felt too cold, how the attic sometimes went silent all at once, how even during the day shadows felt heavier there. I remembered how my aunt would pause sometimes and look toward the ceiling as if listening for something she didn't want to mention. None of us questioned it back then. Houses were just houses. But now, knowing the history, knowing the stories from people who lived there, everything feels connected in a way that makes the whole place seem alive with its own past. Years went by, and eventually my aunt and uncle moved out in the early 1990s. Life changed. Everyone moved on, and the house became just another memory that occasionally resurfaced during family conversations. But part of me never forgot it, and I always wondered what it looked like inside now, if anything had changed or stayed the same. Last year, I finally decided to knock on the door. The new owners opened it, and they seemed polite enough, though not particularly interested in my curiosity about the house's past. I tried to ask gently, without sounding strange, if the attic still had coffins in it. They looked at me with a puzzled expression, as if they had no idea why anyone would ask such a question. They told me there were no coffins left in the attic. Everything old had been cleared out long before they bought the place. The house, they said, was just a house now. But even after hearing that, I am not sure the house ever really let go of its past. Some places hold memories too deeply to be washed away by renovation or new furniture. Some walls absorb the echoes of sorrow, music, pain, or kindness, and keep them quietly tucked inside long after the people have gone. The new owners might not feel anything, or maybe the house simply isn't ready to show itself to them. But when I think back on the attic full of coffins, the woman singing gently to a child who never received the dignity he deserved, and the man who ran naked into the street because a shadow moved where no one should have been, I know the house still carries every moment that ever happened inside it. And even though there may be no coffins left now, the memory of them and everything else that once lived in that house does not leave as easily as objects do. Some things stay with you whether you want them to or not. Daniel and I had planned the trip for weeks. We were both restless, tired of our routine, and needed a day where nothing mattered except the sun, the sand, and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. So early one summer morning, we packed a cooler, grabbed towels, tossed a speaker into the truck, and made the long drive down toward the coast. The sky was clear, the air warm, and everything felt like the perfect start to a carefree day. When we finally reached the beach, it was crowded but not chaotic. Families had set up umbrellas, kids ran screaming through the surf, and couples lay on blankets soaking in the heat. We found a good spot away from the busiest area and spent the entire day swimming, throwing a frisbee, wandering barefoot through the sand, and just letting time pass without thinking about it. The sun felt so good after months of being stuck at work that we didn't even notice it, sinking lower and lower. When the sky finally started turning soft shades of pink and orange, we still weren't ready to leave. We sat on the bed of my truck, watching the horizon shift from bright daylight to the quiet colors of sunset, listening to music and talking about nothing important. By the time we finally packed up, the sun had disappeared completely. Midsummer sunsets always stretch long, so even though the sky stayed a little golden, we were basically walking in dim twilight. The air cooled fast, carrying that salty breeze that always feels colder after you've been in the water all day. We threw our things into the truck, shut the doors, and headed out. The route back home wasn't the same highway we came in on. To avoid late traffic, Daniel had suggested taking a back road route that cut through miles of forest before reconnecting with civilization. I didn't mind. I liked the winding roads and the quietness around them. So we took the turnoff and started heading down those long, dark stretches of asphalt that felt like they were carved straight into untouched wilderness. Out there, once the sun was gone, it became pitch black. There were no street lamps, no houses, not even distant porch lights. It was like driving through a tunnel of trees, except the tunnel stretched for miles. The branches leaned overhead in places, The forest on both sides so thick that you couldn't see more than a foot into it. The shoulders of the road were narrow, almost non-existent, making it look like the trees had slowly inched closer, year after year, reclaiming whatever land they could. The headlights of my truck sliced through the darkness, bright but somehow not bright enough, making a narrow path of visibility that moved ahead of us as we drove. Daniel was relaxed at first, scrolling through his phone, changing songs, and occasionally making fun of the way my truck bounced on potholes. But after a while, the silence outside the windows felt so heavy that even he started glancing around, as if expecting something to appear just beyond the beams of light. We took curve after curve, the road bending like it followed a river. I kept the speed up because it felt better to just keep moving. Slowing down on a road like that made the darkness feel too close. We weren't scared, at least not yet, just alert in the way you get when everything outside feels unfamiliar. We were in the middle of another long curve when it happened. 1 second the road was empty, the next there was a man walking across it. Not running, not stumbling, walking. He stepped out from the trees on the right and crossed calmly like he was out for a midnight stroll in a neighborhood that didn't exist for 50 miles. His entire body looked pale, unnaturally pale, almost glowing in the headlights. Not glowing like a ghost, glowing like he had been painted white from head to toe. Even his clothes looked white, though I couldn't make out details because everything happened so fast. But the part that shook me straight out of my relaxed state was that he was looking right at us. The whole time he crossed. His head didn't turn away. He didn't flinch at the sound of the engine. He didn't jump back like most people would when they see a vehicle coming fast around a curve. He just kept his eyes on us as he placed one foot in front of the other and disappeared into the trees on the other side before we could get close enough to pass next to him. I hit the brakes lightly out of instinct, but I didn't stop. Something about the look on that man's face, calm, too calm, made it impossible to even think about slowing down more than necessary. Daniel looked over at me, wide-eyed, and I looked back at him for just a second. Neither of us said anything, but the silence between us said everything. Yes, I saw that. Yes. He looked at us the entire time. No, this makes no sense. I picked up speed again because the idea of stopping on that road made my skin crawl. Every part of my brain was screaming that whatever we saw wasn't normal and that staying still would be the worst thing we could do. We kept going for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The forest seemed even darker now, like seeing that man had changed something in the air itself. The silence outside had a weight to it. The shadows seemed thicker. The trees felt closer to the road. I tried to focus on the white lines ahead of me, counting the curves, focusing on the rhythm of driving. I didn't want to think about the man. I didn't want to think about the blank expression on his face or the slow, steady steps he took toward the forest. Then we reached a long, straight stretch. For the first time on that road, I felt like I could breathe again. No curves to hide anything, no shadows that could suddenly reveal a person stepping out. Just a long, empty strip of asphalt. Until he crossed again. The same man, the same white skin, the same pale clothes, the same slow steps, and once again he stared at us the entire time he crossed. I felt my heart slam into my ribs. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't need to. My hands tightened on the steering wheel and I didn't even glance at him this time. I kept my eyes forward, locked on the road, because if I looked away, I knew I would start panicking. I didn't understand how he got there. We hadn't stopped. We hadn't turned off. There were no side roads, no paths we had missed. Nothing but forest stretching endlessly in both directions. There was no explanation. I didn't speed up at first. I just kept my pace, pretending I didn't feel the cold wave of fear building in my stomach. But after we passed where he had disappeared back into the trees, my foot pressed harder on the gas without me even thinking about it. I remember swallowing hard, feeling like my mouth had gone dry. I kept waiting for Daniel to say something, to break the tension, to tell me I wasn't crazy. But he stayed silent, staring straight ahead, gripping the door with one hand. I didn't want to see that man again, but we did. Not much farther down the road, he appeared again. Same pace, same stare. This time it felt like he stepped onto the road almost as soon as we got near him. I didn't see him come from the trees. He was just suddenly there, walking calmly from one side to the other. I felt myself breathing fast, almost too fast. Every part of my body wanted to pull over, to stop the truck, to get out and catch my breath. But something else inside me, a deep, instinctive fear, kept telling me to keep going no matter what. Do not stop. Do not slow down. Do not give the darkness around you a chance to swallow the truck. The farther we drove, the worse it became. He kept appearing, crossing, always looking at us, always stepping into the trees before we could get a close look. Sometimes minutes apart, sometimes seconds. The repetition became maddening. It felt like the road looped and trapped us in one long nightmare where the only constant was that pale man walking across the asphalt again and again. My hands were sweating. My chest felt tight. Daniel finally whispered, "Don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." I didn't need him to tell me that. Every time the man vanished into the trees, I kept expecting to see him again immediately. Every bend, every shadow, every broken patch of moonlight made me flinch. The road seemed endless, twisting deeper and deeper into the woods with no hint of civilization ahead. It felt like an hour passed that way, maybe more. I lost all sense of time. I just drove, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers hurt, forcing myself not to blink for too long. The air felt heavy inside the truck. Neither of us wanted to talk. We barely even breathed. Eventually, after more appearances of that man than I could count, the trees finally thinned, and we saw the faint glow of distant highway lights. Civilization, cars, noise, something normal. When the truck rolled onto the interstate, it felt like stepping out of cold water into warmth again. I didn't say anything at first. Daniel didn't either. We just let the silence sit there, heavy and exhausted, until finally he let out a shaky breath and said, "Man, whatever that was, I'm not going back on that road again." Neither am I. And even though nothing dramatic happened at the end, no crash, no attack, no supernatural explosion, that simple repeated sight was one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what happens. It's what keeps happening over and over, without any explanation, until it feels like your mind is unraveling and the world around you no longer follows the rules you've always trusted. I don't know who that man was. I don't know how he appeared again and again. And I don't think I ever want to find out. One Saturday night, the parents had dinner plans, something they didn't get to enjoy often. They hired a babysitter, a college student named Marissa, who lived down the street. She'd watched the kids a few times before and knew the routine. Dinner at 7, baths by 8, bedtime shortly after. She was friendly, patient, good with kids, and the children liked her. Before leaving, the parents gave her one extra piece of advice. The kids might talk about a monster in the closet. They get worked up about it sometimes. Just calm them down, check the closet to reassure them, and send them back to bed. Marissa laughed lightly. She'd handled kids scared of the dark before. "No problem," she said. "I'll take care of it." The parents left. The house quieted, and everything seemed normal at first. Dinner went smoothly. Bath time was full of splashing and giggles. By bedtime, the kids were yawning, clinging to their favorite stuffed animals. Marissa tucked them in, read a short story, kissed them on the forehead, and turned off the light. The soft glow of the hallway nightlight spilled into the room. Downstairs, she settled onto the couch, flipped through channels, and let herself relax. Babysitting was easy money when everything went right. It didn't go right. Maybe an hour passed before she heard small footsteps on the stairs. She looked up to see the 4-year-old boy standing at the bottom step, rubbing one eye with his tiny fist. "What's wrong, buddy?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then whispered, "The monster in the closet is awake." Marissa remembered what the parents told her. She smiled reassuringly. "There's no such thing as monsters. Come on, let's go tuck you back in." She carried him upstairs. The hallway felt a little colder than before, but she didn't think much of it. She placed him gently into bed, pulled the blanket up to his chin, and turned toward the closet. "See? Nothing scary," she said as she opened it. The closet was filled with little clothes hanging neatly. Tiny shirts, jackets, dresses, a row of shoes on the floor. Normal, completely normal. She crouched to check under the bed too, just to show the boy everything was safe. "All clear," she said. "You're okay." The child nodded, but his eyes didn't completely relax. Still, he lay back down, and Marissa headed downstairs. She had barely settled onto the couch again when she heard footsteps once more, softer this time, hesitant. And when she looked up, he was there again, trembling, his face pale. "The monster came back," he whispered. Marissa sighed softly, more tired than irritated. Kids his age had wild imaginations. She stood, stretched her back, and walked him upstairs again. As they got closer to the bedroom, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. The closet light was on. She hadn't turned it on earlier, she was certain. The door was closed, but a thin, bright strip of light glowed under the gap at the bottom. That alone was strange enough. But then she saw something that made her freeze halfway through her next step. 2 shadows. 2 human-shaped shadows stood behind the door, each a pair of legs about 3 feet apart. Perfectly still, perfectly dark, perfectly wrong. At first, she thought it had to be a trick of the light. Maybe furniture casting a weird shape. Maybe her eyes playing tricks on her. But the shadows were too distinct, too real. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed both kids, one arm around the boy, the other reaching for the girl, who had woken up and was now staring silently at the closet. Marissa didn't even pause to think. Her instincts screamed, "Run!" She hurried the kids down the stairs, nearly slipping in her panic. Once outside, she ran with them straight across the lawn toward the neighbor's house. Her hands shook as she pounded on the door. "Call 911, she gasped. "Someone's inside." The neighbor brought them inside, locked the door, grabbed the phone, and called the police. While they waited, the kids clung to Marissa, trembling. She held them tight, shaking herself. Neither spoke, neither cried. They just listened to the silence outside, terrified of what had been in that closet. When the police arrived, Marissa went with them back to the house. Officers swept the home quickly, room by room, closet by closet. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no open windows, nothing missing, no footprints inside, no hiding places. Disturbed. The closet light, the one she saw shining brightly less than 20 minutes earlier, was now off. The officers exchanged looks, half concerned, half skeptical. But then one of them noticed something odd by the edge of the backyard, a trail of crushed grass leading toward the trees. A few minutes later, another officer shouted, "Found someone!" They located an older man crouched in the bushes at the edge of the property, wearing a full clown suit, a bright, colorful clown suit, even though it was past midnight. His face was painted. His hair was a frizzy rainbow wig. He held a balloon in one hand, deflated and limp. His clothes were dirty, stained from crawling in the bushes. His eyes were wide and glassy, like he wasn't fully aware of where he was. They tackled him, cuffed him, and dragged him into the open. The kids started screaming. Marissa held them close, her heart pounding so hard she felt sick. Later, the police discovered that the man had escaped from a psychiatric facility a few towns away. He had a history of breaking into homes but had never harmed anyone. Yet, he had an obsession with children and with closets. Doctors said he thought closets were gateways, though no one knew exactly what that meant. The family never stayed in that house again. And for years afterward, Marissa couldn't babysit without checking every closet first, not once, but twice or 3 times. She said she still remembers the moment she noticed the light on, the moment she saw the 2 shadows under the door, the moment she realized the kids hadn't imagined the monster in their closet at all. They had been telling the truth. Something really had been standing there in the dark, watching, waiting, and smiling behind the door. There are a few moments in life that stay with you forever, no matter how many years pass or how many times people tell you that you must be remembering it wrong. Some memories just settle deep inside you and refuse to fade. This story is one of those memories for me, something I've held on to since childhood. And even though most of the people I've told over the years haven't believed me, some laughed, some politely nodded, some said I must have imagined it, I know with absolute certainty what happened. I was there, I felt it, and I've spent my entire life defending it to myself and to others. I was around 8 or 9 years old at the time. At that age, kids usually have wild imaginations, and I wasn't any different. I created stories in my head, played pretend games, made whole worlds out of cardboard boxes and blankets. But what I'm about to share wasn't imagination. It wasn't a dream or a moment of childish confusion. It was real. I've never doubted it, not even for a second, not even when people tried to convince me otherwise. To understand the moment, I have to start with the place where it happened, my grandmother's house. I lived on the same road as her for most of my life, so I spent countless days and nights there. That house wasn't just old, it was ancient, the kind of structure that feels like it's lived more lives than the people inside it. It had been standing long before my grandmother moved in with my grandfather. It's where my father grew up with his 4 siblings, 2 older brothers, 1 younger brother, and 1 younger sister. All of them were raised within those walls, which made the house feel even more alive, as if the laughter and fights and memories of generations were still hanging in the air. The house was massive, not just big, massive in a way that seems almost unreal for the era in which it was built. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 staircases if you counted the small one in the back, and hallways that stretched longer than you'd expect. Houses weren't typically built that large back then, at least not for ordinary families. There was something regal about it, even though it wasn't fancy or modern. It had a quiet grandeur, the kind that made you lower your voice when you walked through it, even if you didn't know why. The centerpiece of the house was the main staircase. It started in the front hallway and rose upward in a long, dramatic flight. It wasn't steep enough to be dangerous on its own, but it was long, at least 15 or 20 steps. The wooden railing was thick and smooth from years of hands sliding along it, and the steps creaked in familiar ways. At the top of the stairs, the hallway branched into several bedrooms and a bathroom. If you kept walking, you reached another hallway with more rooms and another bathroom. This was the area where my experience took place. I remember that day like it happened yesterday. The lighting, the hallway, the faint smell of something cooking downstairs. Every detail is burned into my memory. I was upstairs with my mother and grandmother. We had all been in the far master bedroom for some reason. I can't recall what we were doing there, maybe looking for something or helping organize the room, but my grandmother had been using that room at the time. I walked out ahead of them about 5 to 10 feet in front and started down the hallway toward the top of the staircase. That's when it happened. I don't know how to describe the feeling that came over me except to say that it was unlike anything I have ever felt before or since. It was as if something, some force, some presence, some invisible warmth flowed through my entire body all at once. I felt weightless, as light as air. My chest expanded with confidence so intense it didn't feel normal for a child. It was like my mind briefly stepped aside and something else took hold. Something that made me feel unstoppable, as if I could do anything in the world. And then, before I even fully knew what I was doing, my body started to move on its own. It wasn't a decision. I didn't think about running. I didn't think about jumping. My legs just did it. I broke into a full sprint toward the staircase. I wasn't scared. I wasn't confused. I wasn't even aware enough to question what was happening. That strange euphoria, light, weightless, fearless, pushed me forward. When I reached the top of the staircase, I jumped. A normal fall would have been disastrous. That staircase was long. Falling down, it would have meant broken bones at best. But as soon as my feet left the floor, the weightlessness didn't fade. It intensified. I felt suspended in the air as if gravity had loosened its grip on me. I didn't drop. I didn't tumble. Instead, I floated. That's the only word that fits. I floated down the staircase. I drifted at a slow, gentle speed, my feet barely touching anything. There was no fear, no pain, no shock. When I reached the bottom, I didn't crash or stumble. I touched down softly on the second-to-last step, the way a feather settles on a surface. The moment my feet touched the wood, everything snapped back to normal. The strange sensation vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The hallway above me looked ordinary again. The staircase felt long and tall. The air around me felt heavy again, real again. I was breathless, not from exertion, just from shock. My mind began racing to catch up to what had happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. I turned and ran back up the stairs, my heart pounding. I reached the top just as my mother and grandmother were starting to walk down the hallway. I practically shouted, "I just flew down the stairs." They both looked at me like they weren't sure whether to laugh, scold me, or worry about me. My mom frowned and said something like, "Don't be silly," and my grandmother gently told me not to run on the stairs. They didn't believe me, not even a little, but it didn't matter. I knew what I had felt. I knew what had happened. And even though I was only 8 or 9, I knew it wasn't hallucination or imagination. It wasn't pretend. My body had floated. I had been lifted, carried by something I still can't explain. As the years passed, I told the story to people I trusted, friends, a few relatives, a couple of people who I thought might understand. The reactions were always mixed. Some shrugged it off as childhood exaggeration. Some said maybe I had dreamt it. Some didn't say anything but gave me a polite nod that told me they didn't believe me at all. Eventually, the constant disbelief wore me down. I stopped telling the story. I didn't need validation. I knew the truth. But it's exhausting defending something that feels so vivid and real to people who've decided not to believe you no matter what. For a long time, I tucked the memory away. It was still there, untouched and powerful, but I didn't talk about it. It became a private part of my past. Then, years later, long after I'd stopped expecting anyone to understand, I had a conversation with my grandmother that brought everything rushing back. We were talking about the supernatural. She knew I had always been interested in things that couldn't be explained. Maybe she sensed I wanted to revisit the topic, or maybe she just felt like sharing something. Out of nowhere, she said, "Did I ever tell you about the lady with the candle at the top of the stairs?" I stared at her. The words landed in my chest like a punch. I wasn't sure what to say. I was afraid she was trying to feed into my old story, to give me something symbolic or comforting. But as she continued talking, her voice didn't sound like she was humoring me. She sounded serious, almost troubled. She told me that when her youngest daughter, my aunt, was little, she used to draw pictures of a lady in a white gown holding a candle, not once or twice, but repeatedly. This figure always stood at the top of the staircase in the drawings. My aunt said she had seen this woman many times, felt her presence, sometimes standing still, sometimes watching, sometimes just there. My grandmother described the drawings in detail. My aunt would draw the gown, the candle, the faint glow around it. She was a child at the time, maybe 5 or 6, but the drawings were consistent. Always the lady, always the stairs. I didn't want to get my hopes up. I didn't want to assume anything. So later I went to my aunt directly. I asked her if the story was true, trying to keep my tone neutral. She didn't laugh. She didn't hesitate. She confirmed it immediately. She remembered drawing the pictures. She remembered seeing the woman. She remembered a presence near the top of the stairs. Not harmful, but powerful, unmistakable. And the place she said she felt it the strongest? Right where I had jumped. Hearing that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't proof, it wasn't an explanation, but it was alignment, something that made the pieces fall into a pattern that suddenly felt less random. I don't claim to know what happened to me that day. I don't know whether the woman with the candle was connected to my experience. I don't know whether she had been protecting me, guiding me, or simply passing through. I don't know why I felt weightless, why I floated, why I jumped without choosing to. But I know this. It happened. I can still feel that strange lightness in my bones when I think about it. I can still picture the stairway, the hallway, the shock of landing so softly. I can still hear myself shouting for my mom and grandmother, not caring whether they believed me. The memory hasn't faded. It hasn't softened. It's as sharp and clear as it was the day it happened. People can believe me or not. That's their choice. But I know what I lived through in that old house. And somewhere, deep down, I think that lady with the candle knows too. One night, when I was around 11 or 12 years old, my friends and I decided to go out and play a game of Ghost in the graveyard. It was one of those summer nights where the air feels heavy and still, and the neighborhood feels completely different once the sun goes down. In our version of the game, one person is chosen to be the ghost, and their job is to find the perfect hiding spot in the dark, while everyone else tries to track them down. On this particular night, I was the ghost. I remember feeling that rush of excitement as I ran off into the shadows, looking for a place where no one would ever think to look. I eventually found a massive, thick bush near the edge of a driveway and decided to crawl right into the heart of it. It was a great spot because the foliage was so dense that it blocked out what little light was coming from the distant street lamps. I settled in, pulled my knees to my chest, and waited in complete silence. As I sat there in the pitch black, I could hear the muffled voices of my friends as they started their search. They were wandering around the yard, their footsteps crunching on the grass. Eventually, they drifted closer to my hiding spot. I stayed perfectly still, barely even breathing, enjoying the fact that I was so well hidden. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped and looked directly toward the bush. He called out, his voice echoing in the quiet night air, saying something like, "Come on, we see you by the bush. Just come out already." I remember smiling to myself because I knew he was bluffing. I was tucked so deep into the shadows that there was no physical way he could see me. This was around 1 a.m., and without any form of flashlights or porch lights nearby, it was the kind of darkness where you couldn't see your own hand if it was right next to your face. I figured they were just trying to bait me into moving so they could win the round. Being a stubborn kid, I decided I wasn't going to give up that easily. I stayed in my hiding spot, determined to let them keep guessing. My friends didn't move on, though. They stayed right there, their voices getting a bit louder and more insistent. They kept yelling, "Come out! We know you're standing right next to the bush." At that point, I thought it would be funny to pull a fast one on them. Since they were so convinced I was inside the bush, I decided to sneak out the side very quietly while their eyes were fixed on the front. I moved like a shadow, crawling low to the ground and looping around the side of the house. I managed to get all the way behind them near the garage without making a single sound. I crept up behind one of my friends and tagged him hard on the shoulder. They all jumped and let out a collective gasp when I touched them, which was the normal reaction for the game. We usually laughed it off, but the vibe felt different this time. As they turned around and realized it was me, one of my friends looked at me with a confused and slightly pale face. He let out a nervous breath and said, "Nice scarecrow tactic, man." I stood there for a second, completely confused. I didn't know what he meant by that. I hadn't used any props, and I wasn't wearing anything weird. I asked him what he was talking about, and he just pointed back toward the bush I had just come from. I turned my head to look, and my heart nearly stopped. I saw a guy standing there. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but he was a big, broad-shouldered man. In the dim light, he looked like a solid mass of darkness, standing perfectly still exactly where my friends thought I had been. As my eyes adjusted, I realized he had what looked like a heavy hammer gripped in his hand. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there in a frozen, menacing posture watching us. The realization hit us all at the same time. That wasn't a scarecrow, and it wasn't a joke. We all absolutely freaked out. The playful atmosphere of the game vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by pure, cold terror. We didn't even stop to think. We just turned and started sprinting toward the house as fast as our legs would carry us. What made it even more terrifying was that the moment we started running, the man didn't just stay there. He started sprinting toward us. The sound of his heavy boots hitting the pavement behind us was enough to send my adrenaline into overdrive. We scrambled through the front door, slammed it shut, and locked every single bolt. We were all hyperventilating, trying to explain to my parents what had just happened. My dad immediately called 911, and we stayed huddled in the living room, staring at the door and waiting for the police to arrive. It felt like hours, but the officers were there pretty quickly. They began searching the property with high-powered flashlights, but the guy was nowhere in sight. He had vanished back into the night as soon as we had made it inside. The police started to investigate the exact area where the man had been standing by the bush. As they moved further down the driveway and into the side yard, the situation turned from a scary encounter into a nightmare. It turns out this guy hadn't just been lurking, he had been busy. The officers discovered that he had brutally beaten someone just moments before we encountered him. The victim had been hit so badly and so many times that the police said they couldn't even tell who it was at first. The level of violence was staggering. It made me realize that while I was hiding in that bush, thinking I was playing a harmless game, I was likely only a few feet away from a monster who was in the middle of committing a horrific crime. The investigation became very intense very quickly. The police were everywhere and the whole neighborhood was blocked off. They started dusting for prints and found several clear sets on the cars parked in our driveway. It seemed the man had been leaning against them or touching them as he moved through the shadows. Using those fingerprints, the forensic team was able to track him down and identify him. It turned out he was a totally insane serial killer who had been on the move. The thought that he was standing right there watching us play while holding a hammer is something that still keeps me up at night. He had been so close that if I hadn't been stubborn and moved to sneak around him, I might have been his next target. It was honestly the scariest thing I've ever experienced, and it changed the way I feel about being out in the dark forever. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.